Hello and welcome to this year's Remothering Masterclass. You can see I'm already brimming with excitement, but let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Simona. My full name is Simona Vivi Haji Georgalis. And in addition to my private coaching practice, I'm the founder of remothering.org, a space created to bring together the wisdom from across modalities, practitioners, and healers to be a resource for those of us on our remothering journeys. And today I am joined by the amazing, sorry, I mean, for me, one of the most important books I read on my own healing journey is the book by Dr. Lindsay Gibson, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. So I am beyond thrilled to be having this conversation with you, Dr. Gibson, and for all of you listening, for you guys to get to meet Dr. Gibson. And if this resonates with you, to then read this book, and she's got workbooks, companion books, we are in for a treat. So actually, before I start, I do want to name something which you and I talked about when we talked on the phone. And you all listening, if you have probably heard me say this, but I think it's worth saying again, which is the remothering work is about us and future us. And so while we are looking in history and we're looking at parenting, it's not a report card on the parenting we did or did not receive. And Lindsay says something similar in her book. It's not a report card on the parenting we did or did not receive. It's sometimes helpful to look at our history so that we can look at our own adaptations with an of courseness and a self-compassion as we look at ourselves and heal forward. So I want to name that, especially for me. I think, Dr. Gibson, you already know that, but sometimes when I start to talk about my own parenting, I can accidentally flip into a victim persona, and I have to be aware that I do that. So I want to name it at the top of this conversation, since we are going to be talking about emotionally immature parents. So that being said, I have my first question, unless there's anything that you would like to say before I get going.
No, it's just a total pleasure and honor to be here, Simone. I love your work and I love your concept, and I'm just so happy to be a part of it today.
Thank you. So my first question is a statement and then a question, because for those of you that don't know yet, Dr. Gibson, I want to start with a statement and then the question, which is, Lindsay, your book, which has over 15,000 five-star reviews and has been #1 Amazon bestseller in its category for a really long time. What do you think that your book has been so popular? And I'll just name the title one more time in case we want people to look it up: Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And I'll just, while I'll flip through, you can see, I don't know if you can see quickly like how many highlights and underlines I have in mind. So if that feels like a comfortable place to get started, that's where I'd love to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, those highlightings do my heart good. Because that's where I know that I've connected with the reader. If they're underlining something or they're highlighting something, because it means that we're literally on the same page. Yeah. uh, but I had when the book really took off, it came out in, I think, 2015, and it did really well for a while. And then somewhere around 2019-ish, it took off. And my editor, if she said it once, she said it 3 times. She said, "What do you think is going on? Why do you think this book is exploding right now?" And I really had to think about that. And what informed my answer was all these responses that people had given me about reading the book. And it came out in the form of the reviews on Amazon. But people also wrote me notes, they left me phone messages, emails. There was so much response and so much gratitude, really. That was what came through. And it was sort of like, how did you know this about me? And were you in our living room when I was growing up? Were you following me around? Because there is a universality about this experience of having parents who are less emotionally mature than you are. And I think that through my own clinical experience, I identified that and put it into words that gave people a definition and a concept of what was going on. Because without that, you grow up with emotionally immature parents and you take their stuff on and children tend to blame themselves for anything that's going on with the parent because, children too are emotionally immature and they're incredibly egocentric. So when things happen, they figure that they caused it. That's just the young mind. So what the book did was it said, yeah, I know it feels that way, but that's not what happened. And this is probably what you were responding to. And then people took all of that self-blame and all of that confusion, which is huge with these parents, and all of their sense of not being good enough, not being able to love enough, um, being kind of a bad person who's trying to get to be a good person, but they're never sure if they are or not.
Mine would be not being the best good girl, a good enough good girl.
Best good girl that there could be, or the best good boy. Absolutely. And what the book did was it said, this is not about you. This loneliness is coming from an experience that can be understood, and it's coming from limitations in your parents' emotional development. And that seemed to be an answer to a question that hadn't been asked yet. And when you get an answer to something that you haven't asked for yet, it's a really mind expanding experience because you haven't even formulated the inquiry yet. And then suddenly, boom, there it is. And it explains what you've been going through.
And
And so,
if
yeah,
I may, yeah, that explains what you've been going through for me. And because one of the things that I want to share with those listening, like there are our personal histories and what brings us to the remothering work are different. And some people's parenting, some people had emotionally mature and healthy parents, and they're here because it's still time to connect with your own wisdom. Some of us, like me, came from that emotionally immature parent background, some emotional neglect, some like high criticism, some physical abuse. I will say for my own story, the emotional immature parent resonated so deeply with me because oh, poor me. I had a roof over my head and food in my belly and someone who got me to school every day. So, it doesn't sound like a poor me story. And so when I read your book, I was finally able to have language for why I felt so disconnected from the story of my perfect childhood to how I felt and all the adaptations and all like the emotional just all the things that it was like they were just incongruent. The story of my childhood and the feelings of my childhood and the adaptations that came out of my childhood were just different. And this was like, oh my gosh, thank you for helping me have language for why. Yeah. So
yeah, and I think that's that is really the answer to the question, is that it gave people language for a very, very real and deep experience that they were having, that in our culture is really, at best it's minimized, but for the most part, in our culture, we really act like the inner world, the emotional world, the attachment world, the emotional attachment world, and all of that is sort of like a luxury,
mm,
like it's an add-on. It's not where it's at. And in our culture, achievement and everything looking good and sort of being successful in whatever way you want to think of that that is what's important, and that's supposed to make you happy. So we as a culture, at least in the United States, I think, we tend to believe that if everything looks okay on the outside, it has to be okay all the way around, because that mindset does not take into account that there is an inner emotional world. And this is what your work is about too. And so when we say, no, wait a minute, it matters hugely, and the outside comes from the inside, not the other way around, um, it gives people permission to acknowledge their experience of reality. Because when I say in my book that children of emotionally immature parents often feel emotional loneliness, that is a reality for them. And it's a reality in general, because it's like we have we have ignored the impact of the emotional so much in our child rearing, in our education, really pretty much across, in our businesses, pretty much across the board in the United States. And it's given us tremendous material wealth, but it's left a lot of hurting people in its wake. So I think that is why people really resonated with it and recommended it to their friends. And then at some point it hit critical mass. And
Yeah, I think I read somewhere it's like the #1 therapist recommended book, is in addition to being so. Yeah, it definitely hit critical mass. You just said a couple of things I jotted down, and I just want to look at my two separate things that really struck my ears. One was the acknowledging the experience of that reality. It because it is so, it's almost, because we don't have a lot of language to talk about emotional attachment or the value of emotional attachment. It does feel like this made up thing, like, oh, poor you, crybaby, like thing that either you're too much, not enough, too sensitive, like just it makes it harder to have language around. So to your point, and I just really wanted to underline that, like the acknowledgement that this is a, like, of our real lived experience, like that there's language for it. It feels really important, and it's not like oh, you're just complaining or trying to get attention or whatever it is.
yeah,
It really hurts, and it really is, it's complicated
yeah,
to heal
and it
from.
has a real impact on your life, and it has a real impact on your happiness. So it's a very big deal.
Yeah. And talking about real, because then those adaptations are what we bring into our life in terms of who we connect with, who we may start relationships with, who we work with. And it can have a really, in my life personally, and I speak this in an out loud voice, not because we're talking about me, but in case it's resonating with others, it just had a really massive rippling effect. And, until I started doing my own work at 30, like it just, the choices I made were like with blinders on, almost just like reacting to the childhood I grew up in, until life kicked my butt strongly enough that I had to look at everything, and been doing the work ever since. The other thing you said that really stood out for me was the outside comes from the inside. And that was another thing I pulled from your book and from a lot of the remothering work, is that inside out versus outside in, esteem, reality, everything. And I think that I just wanted to underline that, because um depending on our backgrounds, and I'll just use mine as an example again, it's like if you can check the boxes, like, okay, like clothes on, school, food and belly, like those are outside in, like more than inside out. Like I feel loved, I feel worthy, I feel whole and safe. So I wanted to underline that as well, because that really struck me as important. Would you agree, disagree, or am I taking this in the
No, I don't think you can take that too far.
okay.
Because like the difference between the two types of adult children um, that I identify, at least those of emotionally immature parents, are the internalizer and the externalizer. And the internalizer tends to be self-reflective. They look at whether or not they had something to do with the problem. They enjoy personal growth. They enjoy understanding motivations. They're very responsible that way, very responsible for their part in things. Whereas the externalizer just looks outside themselves, and everything that happens is somebody else's fault. They don't self-reflect. They don't evaluate the impact of their actions, or what they don't look down the road to think about what they're actually building for their life. They're pretty impulsive. So that's a classic example of people who work enough on their internal experiences and understanding themselves. And it's like figuring out a scientific puzzle. It's like, what am I doing on my inside that's creating a better outside for me?
Mm.
And when you work at that, you really find the things that are getting in your way or that could facilitate you getting what you want. Whereas the externalizers tend to bang around inside the box saying, where did that come from? Why did they do that to me? And it does not give you power or traction in your life to go after the things that you want. So to me, it's a huge thing, and it's like kind of like the biggest well-kept secret, that working on your inside world and your emotional experiences is going to empower you in a way that no amount of external education or material benefit is going to be able to do. You got to have that curiosity and understanding of yourself in order to really do your best.
So hearing that, if someone's gotten this far into our talk, they're most likely an internalizer. But I'm curious, something you just said maybe really struck me, which is for those of us that have siblings, if we've been raised by the same parents but come out with very different experiences, this could be something that could be causing friction between siblings. I don't know if I'm going to peek at my questions to see. I don't know if I want to pull that thread or not, or just name it, but maybe if there's like a brief, like,
Yeah.
do you think maybe something brief before we switch gears, but because that seems important.
Yeah, it's such a huge mystery, isn't it? Different kids, same parents, and they can turn out so differently. The only thing I've ever found that helped explain it to me was that I think neurologically, internalizers probably tend to be more perceptive and more sensitive. In other words, they are affected more by things, and their natural, maybe it's sort of like the yin and the yang, their natural tendency is to pull in and do something with it, think about it, feel it, contemplate it. That's their internalizing instinct, which makes them great learners and very curious and all of that. So I think there's probably some sort of neurological difference in the way that they greet the world. And maybe that's part of what is happening.
Well, thank you for going on that little side tangent with me. If you're wondering if you know someone that's an emotionally immature adult, how do you emotional immaturity without just so in service to the relationship or in service to our own mental or physical well-being without just oh, that's an emotionally immature person. That's where I want to go.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining me on that.
Absolutely. No, I find you very easy to follow.
Thank you.
I think that there are there are many characteristics of emotional immaturity, but there are 5 or 6 hallmarks. So I'll talk about those, but I also wanted to say that when you're in a relationship with anybody where it ends up there being conflict a lot, it ends up being a lot about that person. You may end up feeling criticized or controlled. These are the things when people start getting a glimmer of, oh, this isn't the person I thought it was, or this relationship is turning out to be a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. That's usually when people uh, are suffering the effects of the other person's emotional immaturity. It's usually not immediately, because everybody's on their best behavior for a long time, actually. And you can do that in small doses. But when the rubber meets the road and you're living with somebody, then the emotional immaturity comes out, because when relationships go to a certain depth, we activate all our childhood memories, all our unresolved stuff. And for an emotionally immature person, that gets projected onto their partner. Okay. And so it makes it very likely that they will instigate conflict or start blaming their partner or start being um, um, unresponsive to their partner because they're so wrapped up with their own stuff. So anyway, it's not apparent with people usually at the very beginning, because everybody is socialized and probably has the social skills to know that you're not supposed to act like this or that on the first date. But let's just look at some of the main characteristics. Like, first and foremost, they're very egocentric. If you just think about kind of like an overgrown 4-year-old, like 4-year-olds are, I call the 4-year-old experience the first adolescence, because they're really at the thick of the process where they're trying to individuate themselves from the parent, become their own little person. But they're really not able to do that yet. They can't emotionally stabilize themselves. They don't really have, well, of course, they don't have good judgment, but they don't even have their own personal boundaries in place yet. But they're demanding, that you let them be who they are and don't get in their way. So they also have language. A 4-year-old has enough language to make you think that you can reason with them. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Like
Lindsay,
they're talking.
that sentence is so important.
Yeah, it is. It really
Oh
is.
my God.
It really is, because we get fooled. Like, if that person is talking, they must be able to reason. And so let me explain to them what my experience is so we can work this out. But you try that with a 4-year-old, and they either resist you, or in a few minutes they're in a tantrum, because you have overtaxed their ability to deal with the situation. So they're very, very difficult to work things out with, because they're so egocentric. It's all about me.
My mind is like, I just wrote that, yeah, like that, because they have enough language that you think you can have a conversation, a reasonable conversation, and that leads into again, I try and use myself as an example just in case it resonates, rather than keeping it in concept. But I'm very aware that I'm using myself as an example as we're talking about making it about yourself.
Yeah, good.
But yeah, that one of my personalities is over explaining, and now I'm like, why I felt like if I just explained it clearly enough,
Right, because
you
you're,
can understand.
yeah, because it feels like they would be able to hear you and think about it and then reflect on it and integrate it, and you could have this really good conversation, right? Where both of you are taking each other in. But if it's an emotionally immature person like that 4-year-old, that's not on their agenda. They're really not all that interested in what's going on with you. They just want to tell you what you've done to them. Um, and then another characteristic that's important is that egocentricity means that you have very poor empathy. So when you try to, and this is what we do with our friends if we're halfway emotionally mature, we appeal to their empathy. We said, let me tell you how I felt, because we trust that they will try that on with their empathic ability, right? And then they'll say, oh, wow, I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I'm really sorry. That would be the expectable outcome. But for an emotionally immature person, they don't imagine the internal psychological reality of other people. They just don't conjure that up. And so other people's subjective experiences are really not on their radar. But and if you have empathy, this is almost impossible to conceptualize that you wouldn't be thinking about or monitoring or registering that other person's emotional experience. That's really hard to imagine if you've gotten to the point where you can do that. We find it very hard to roll that back.
And
But for a person who hasn't achieved that yet, they find it very hard to imagine why you would be interested in that.
that's fascinating. And Lindsay, I'm curious because I know that many people in the in the remothering community are, I would say, that's like something that we learned from like so young of an age, that empathy that I don't even remember learning it. And again, I don't know everybody in our remothering community, but those that I know, that's just something that I hear over and over again. The person that's able to walk into a room and read the room, the idea that that's actually a one, a learned thing, and two, something that a person has none of is, I guess I'm having a hard time getting my head around what you're saying. I mean, I am hearing you. I've read that, but is that like it? I guess my mind is like, how, to your point, that, yeah, how can that be? But it can be. It is a
Right.
learned skill.
No, it is a learned skill. I think we have an innate readiness to be empathic, because when we're really little, there's like an automatic responsiveness that's there. If you've noticed, even in babies, they mimic our faces, and they show interest and concern to other distressed children, and so there's something there at the very beginning. It's not all learned, but the ability to sort of imaginatively put yourself in someone else's shoes and imagine what is happening in their mind as well as their feelings. That's something that some people develop and some people don't. So well, I just want to mention that with the empathy thing, sometimes emotionally immature people will show empathy, but it's really, and that goes to the sort of like the inherent human ability to feel some empathy at times. The problem with emotionally immature people is that they are so psychologically defensive. They do not want to be vulnerable. They've learned for some reason in their lives that they're going to depend on their persona and their sort of ability to have power in the world to carry them through. And then they don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want to be emotionally intimate. They don't want to be close and get to know people in a deep sense, because it makes them feel unsafe. And when they feel unsafe, they go on the defense. And then it's like whatever empathy was there is completely shut down. And now all they can think about is what's going on with them. It's really interesting how that happens. So that leads to them not being self-reflective. So they're not asking themselves the question, oh, we're having this conflict. Could it be something I did? Or, is there some truth in what they're telling me? That no, because they're so defended at that point. And and one of their favorite defenses is projecting blame. Okay.
Yeah, that one.
So,
I've been on the receiving end of that one.
we all have. And it feels incredibly unfair.
It does.
But a part of what they're doing with that is they're in a way, reconstructing reality so that they don't feel so imperiled or so vulnerable. So for instance, when an emotionally immature person looks at a situation, they look at it through the eyes of what one researcher called affective realism, meaning that they don't look at a situation and analyze it in a thoughtful, reflective way. They look at a situation, they jump to a conclusion in which they are either going to be completely right or completely wrong. And when they're right, they're good. When they're wrong, they're bad. So they will fight to the death to not be wrong, because that means that they're a bad person. It's very black and white, very rigid. But the affective realism means that if they feel like you've done something, then you've done it.
Mhm.
All they have to do is feel that way, or they feel like you're being disrespectful, or they feel, whatever it is that they're having the feeling about. That's what they base their interpretation of reality on. And you cannot talk them out of it,
Wow.
because they're not listening to the evidence ever. They're listening to how it felt to them.
Lindsay, if I ask a question here, will that throw us off from talking about the characteristic traits?
No, no.
Okay, because you just said something about the fight to the death, and so I'd like to take us like a little bit on a tangent and then come back to that, which is
Right.
something that I am grappling with is I am in a relationship. With an emotionally immature parent, and so sometimes, and for a very long time, I mean, up until this year, I was like, if she just does the work, we can have this great relationship that she says we have. Like I was believing the story, even though I'm learning, like it's fascinating to witness myself, parts of me knowing the reality and parts of me believing still at 51 the story that I have. It's like fascinating that I can believe both at the same time. So I was still believing that there was a possibility that if she just did the work, we could have a different relationship. And so I say this because one of the things you just said, fight to the death, whenever I don't comply with like her version of the world and reality, and even if I've worked on my I statements and my clean boundaries and my like owning my own, like being very careful and working so hard to breathe so I'm not flipping my lid, and still if I state like in the best way I can whatever I'm saying, if it doesn't serve, this is my perspective and she may have a very different perspective, so I'll just say that, but my experience of it is if I say something that doesn't serve the vision she has of herself as the good mother, some part of her, this is my made up story, some part of her does not know that I'm her daughter and just like comes at me hardcore. Like, and when you said fight to the death, I was like, that's who I feel like comes at me like this. And so that is fascinating. What you just said really just,
Isn't it? I mean, I think it's fascinating too, because, and I've asked myself that question a lot, like, why would they flip out like that and go into this no holds barred, often, quite nasty attitude toward their own child and say incredibly hurtful things? And it seems, it seems like, even given their overall emotional maturity, it seems like it's in a league past that when they do that. I mean, it's really very hurtful, very upsetting, and it feels directed, like the point of a spear. So the way I understand that is that, remember when I said that if we're right, we're good. If we're wrong, we're bad. That's the emotionally immature rigidity and black and white thinking. For them, if they've made a mistake, they are totally bad. Okay. And this is what children do.
Yeah.
Children feel like that. That's why they go into tantrums and they get so upset about everything, because it's all or nothing. So when they do that, what's happening is that you just imagine that they have just gone into the abyss of total abandonment and complete absence of human support. They have gone into a terrifying state where it's like they're floating untethered in space. They have just been cut off from everything and they have no grounding, and they're about to be annihilated, because if you're all bad, you have no right to exist. That's what they're trying to get back from when they attack you. They're trying to get back to earth. They're trying to reestablish some kind of like feeling that they're somehow back in the world, because it's a fight to the death, because they're fighting for their life. They think that if we come to the conclusion that I made a mistake, that is, I am a bad person, and lots of parents will say this, they'll say, well, I just must be the worst mother ever.
That is my yes, I've heard that line so many times.
Yeah, so they go into
I'm like,
they go into that mode, because for them they're fighting for their life, for their ability to be still lovable. And for them, see, it's a one-way trip. Like they don't go into like, we're having a fight, we're angry with each other, but we're still two separate individuals who can go on living without each other. No, it's like, if you don't think I'm wonderful, I'm nothing. And nobody can stand that feeling for very long. And that's why they come back fighting, because, now you're going to be the worst kid ever, or you're going to be the worst person ever. It's not me, it's you. And it's all this ham-handed, awkward, extreme way of modulating their self-esteem and their emotional stability, so that they don't fly off into feeling like I'm about to die, I'm about to be annihilated, I'm a baby abandoned in the desert. That's where they go.
and I would like to say here two things, but the very first thing I want to say is to myself and everyone listening, like if we were raised by emotionally immature parents, we may feel sometimes that untethered and that fearful. And so just because you feel that doesn't mean that you are emotionally immature parent yourself or emotionally immature person yourself. And I really just want to underline that, because that is the remothering moment. Like when we feel that terrible, those of us that are listening, part of this community, there's so many tools, and one of them is to turn within and be like, I've got you, I am here. And so I just want to, because we have sensitive ears and we're like, oh my God, I had that, I've done that, to just know that doesn't mean, of course you're going to have that sometimes. That's what you learned, that's what we learned, that's what we modeled, that's what we've probably done in our lifetime, and that's the of courseness of our adaptation, and that's why we do the work. And I just really, yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, and thank you for bringing that into the conversation at this point, because yeah, it's not like their experience is particular to emotional immaturity. All of the attachment research, I mean, even going back to Harry Harlow, who did attachment research with baby rhesus monkeys, and found out all these things about attachment and how devastating it is to young mammals to be separated from their caregivers. I mean, groundbreaking research. And yes, all of us can have that feeling, because it's probably it's probably evolutionarily a really good thing for a baby to feel that kind of existential distress when they're feeling abandoned or uncared for or something, because they're going to start wailing and that probably will bring care from somebody, because it's such an excruciating experience. So yes, it is definitely the part, it is definitely a part of the mammal attachment experience, that when you feel threatened in your attachment, you have that untethered, I'm floating in outer space, I'm nowhere with no one kind of abandoned feeling. That is absolutely human. And I love how you and your work are teaching people what to do when they feel that way.
Thank you.
Like there's an answer to that. It's a call for a legitimate emotional attachment need. And if you can learn to hear it that way and respond to it in your remothering way, what a wonderful capacity to have carrying around within yourself. So I love that. I love that. Yes, that there is an answer to that, and it is the remothering of whatever type.
Mm. Yay. Yay for the remothering moment.
Yay.
Ah, but yeah, this has been, I'm so curious. It's fascinating because even though I keep clicking on this book, I've read it, the marginalia. I mean, I've read it so many times, but I'm still learning as you're speaking. I'm like, oh, I'm learning it even more deeply. So I appreciate you going through these. There are nuances that I definitely either wasn't ready to hear or didn't pick up the first time, but like, yeah, like my mind's like, whoa, tell me more about these, what characteristics we can look for in emotional maturity, because I'll tangent and then come back to it. I'm realizing there's, and I said this once, but I'll say it again, it's just there's still parts of me that are like believing if I explain better or if I ask the question differently that I'll have a different response. And I'm hearing that maybe one day in the future, if we each both do our own work, but maybe not. Like maybe no amount of explanation is gonna solve it, and no amount of hoping that I don't get the come back at me, or the, oh well, then I guess I'm the worst mother in the world, come back at me. Like it's, I've a question that maybe I'll circle back to this question, which is, if we choose to be in relationship with an emotionally immature parent, like, is that just, what advice do you have for us?
Well, there are different responses to that. And in fact, I have a book coming out in July called Disentangling from Emotionally Immature People. And that has like
Excited.
50 questions that people can look up. It's kind of a handbook.
Mm.
And one of them is about, one of the questions is about what you're talking about. Like, I know how to communicate, I try to communicate, and it doesn't work. And why am I not able to do this with my parent when these communication skills are so effective with everybody else? And it's because so many of the communication techniques that we learn have to do with the thinking, rational part of our brain. But what you're really after with that communication is an emotional connection at an empathic level. So you're trying to, you're trying to use pliers to push a nail into a board. It's like, yeah, it's a tool, but will it work in this situation with this person? Yeah, probably not, because the words are there, the concepts are there, but you can't give somebody the ability to take it in and process it in an emotionally receptive way. So it's not easy for them to be fair about it. It's not easy for them to recognize your feelings and respond to that. That's really, in many cases, beyond them. So, well, there's another part of it too, and that is that emotionally immature people see the reality that they need to see. I talked about that with the feelings, but there's another dimension to it, which is, like a little more foundational, that's even more worrisome, which is that if you present a reality to them that they don't like, or threatens to send them into that tailspin of low self-esteem, or really, I should say, obliterated self-esteem, then they really go into something that changes the reality. And it's an excellent defense. I mean, because you can't get past it, but they distort, dismiss, or deny the reality that you're presenting to them. So if you said, to your parent, I want to tell you how I felt when you said this or whatever, and the effect that that has on me, and the effect that that's having on our relationship. And they'll say, I didn't say that, or I didn't do that, or don't be so silly. Or they say, no, I said this other thing, and that was after you said this thing. You're like, no, that's not true. Why are they so mixed up? It's not that they're so mixed up, it's that they pull things that create the reality that help them to feel best about themselves. And that is such an immediate, defenses are immediate, they're involuntary, they're automatic. It isn't like we sit around dreaming up what we're going to say next. It's like they are there. They're saying those things that I just mimicked. As quickly as you say something to them, they've got an answer like that. And it makes it extremely hard to reach any kind of understanding. And another reason why it's hard to reach that understanding is that they are terrified of emotional intimacy. They really are scared of it. So if they were to take in what you said, process it, own their responsibility, and come back and say, honey, I had no idea. I am so sorry that I have responded in that way. I'm going to try to do better, but I'm so sorry that you have been feeling this way. Okay. That would increase emotional intimacy between you. You'd feel
My whole system, actually, just hearing you say those words, and we're like, oh, I'll
good.
take that one.
It feels really good. Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. So they would go into, or would feel drawn into emotional intimacy. And because they have such deep fears about their own goodness and deservingness and worthiness, they cannot stand that kind of intimacy. So then they might say something to start a fight, or diminish you or invalidate you, which will make you mad. And then now we can have a fight, but it creates distance. So that's another thing about them that makes it hard.
What I think I'm hearing you say is, and I'll again use myself as an example, as me to accept that that's just not like the relationship that I have fantasized about. And you talk about our healing fantasy in your book, which was really the start of me realizing, which was like, I guess it's time to just accept that, like, that's just not a relationship that is just not in the cards. And just as if she had a physical disability and couldn't have use of one of her arms, I wouldn't keep wishing for her to have use of her arm that she didn't have use of. It's just an acceptance of, this is what you get, this is what you get, this is what you've got.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of the process. I think another thing to consider, though, is that when we set boundaries with emotionally immature people, in which we say, I can't do that, I'm not going to continue doing this, I'm going to do it this way, whatever you're saying to them, where you're setting a boundary, you up the chances that you can have a better relationship with them. Now that sounds paradoxical, because
could you say more on that? That would be great.
Yeah, they don't like boundaries. They feel loved when you're under their control, and when everything they say is correct and everything you say is up to their judgment to decide if it makes sense or not. When you set boundaries, it allows you to be the relationship leader, and you are kind of taking the reins and modeling, we can do this, but we can't do that. Or it's okay when we do this, but it's not okay when you do that. And it's not any fancier than that. But somehow putting those rails on their reactivity and their controllingness, I think actually ups the odds that you can have a better relationship, because you will become less impatient with them.
Mm.
You'll become less exasperated by them, because you won't have your boundaries being pushed all the time. You'll know where you start and stop. And so it's, if you're hoping to have a better relationship with them, I think that it's twofold. One is the acceptance and the understanding that you mentioned. And then secondly, it's okay, given that, what kind of boundaries do I have to put in place so that I'm not being hurt by this relationship or by this interaction? And how can I continue to have more successful interactions with them, but not expect that we're going to have a complete turnaround in the relationship?
That's powerful. I was looking at my notes because I did also have a question about boundaries, but I want to name for folks as you're listening to this, because for those of us that were raised by emotionally immature parents, boundaries may be a new topic. And so if you're listening to this and that's a new topic, we will have other talks on the topic of boundaries. A lot of articles on boundaries over at Medium, so I'll post those in the notes too. So just the language of boundaries. So if you're hearing this and you're like, tell me more about these boundaries, I'm about to ask Dr. Gibson some questions. So we're going to get some information about boundaries right now, but I also want to let you all know that there will be more information about boundaries as well, because tell us more, because it can be really frustrating. And I'll share an example from my own life that I shared in last year's masterclass, which is because of my life circumstances, I ended up living 1 mile from my parents. That's a longer story. And when I moved here almost 20 years ago, I said to my mother, like, I would like it if you do not stop by without giving me a heads up first. And to this day, there's still like tension about that. What a bad daughter I am. Like, what kind of a mother has to make an appointment with her daughter to just stop by? And so it got to the place where I was like, you can be upset about it, but this is still the way that these are my needs. And if you do that, like I ended up like, I'll have to change the lock. Or if you do that, like I'm going to put a shade on the window so I can just pull it down. Like I had to just say what I was going to do. It hasn't changed the rhetoric still, which is what a terrible daughter I am, or what kind of mother I was making with their daughter. So in 20 years, it brought the temperature down, but it's not gone. So can you say more about maybe why is it so frustrating to set a boundary with an emotionally immature other?
Yeah, I love that, because the problem is that when you set a boundary, you're likely to not feel a sense of success. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important to set the boundary. Okay. But because they are so unself-reflective, and because anybody who stops their control is likely to be seen as someone who doesn't love them, or somebody who doesn't care about them, or somebody who thinks that they're bad or undesirable, or they take it to that extreme. It's really hard for them to be reasonable about respecting boundaries. Like, a parent might think that, well, like your example of, I have to make an appointment with my daughter. Yeah, it's like, it's not making an appointment, it's doing a courtesy.
Yes.
Yeah,
Which any other person would do.
right, but they reframe it to make it into a rejection. And
Oh
then
my
you're like,
gosh.
I didn't say that. That wasn't what I was doing. But for them, that's how their world goes. It's very black or white like that. But I do tell people, when they come in, they say, well, I was all ready for it. I had my boundaries in place. I told them, and then they acted like I never said anything. Like one woman, just a quick little story. She noticed that her mother was feeding their dog from the table, and she had told her mother a million times, don't feed the dog at the table, right? Because they were training him. So the mother does it again. And she said, Mom, if you do that one more time, you're never coming back to my house. And the mother was like, oh, for heaven's sake, but she stopped feeding the dog. Okay. Now, my client felt very bad about that. Because she had no satisfaction interpersonally from her mother, that her mother had heard her, respected her, and wouldn't do it anymore. There's no acknowledgement. She's like, oh, for heaven's sake. So she had no sense of satisfaction for setting the boundary, but the mother didn't do it anymore.
Wow.
So it's that kind of thing where you don't come out of boundary setting with emotionally immature people feeling more effective or more competent. You come out of it feeling like, like there's something that's still going on. I didn't really stop it. But you should expect that, because that's what happens with them. And if there is any improvement in the thing that you wanted, with the boundary, like in your case, it might be to not be interrupted. If there's any improvement in that from what it was before, that's where you should have the pat on the back, because things have changed. You just won't get the satisfaction because the other person.
I love that you just underlined that, because it took a long time, but the behavior has absolutely changed, but the rhetoric around the behavior still comes at me sometimes.
Sure.
And so back to the acceptance, like, okay, I love that we're unpacking this slowly, because it's like, yeah, it was following the formula for boundaries and then having no satisfaction, and then having that rhetoric come at me and also framed as a rejection instead of a courtesy. But that's the acceptance piece and the boundaries piece and the looking at the results. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And
You're not going to have the impact on them that you want,
no.
and that you could have with someone who was more empathic and less egocentric.
So, Dr. Gibson, we have a little time. Does it make sense to go back to the list that you started to share with us of ways to notice if someone's emotionally mature, or do you think that we've hit on enough characteristics that people might be able to recognize when they're in a relationship with an emotionally immature person?
I think we've covered that pretty well. I do.
Okay.
So I would just leave it up to whatever you feel like talking about.
Yeah, I'll say I'll refer, for those of you who are listening to the list, I'll refer you to the book. And now I'm really excited about your upcoming book. So that'll be coming soon. The next question, and maybe I'll have this be our final question, and then if there's anything else that wants to be pulled forward, is since in the context of the remothering work, and again, for all of us, it is about us and future us, but knowing the history, knowing how these being raised by an emotionally immature parent could have helped shape our history colored glasses, shaped our adaptations, shaped our internal self-talk. What might be some of the most harmful impacts of having been raised by an emotionally immature adult in the context of knowing that we can work towards healing them ourselves? So it's not about like, oh, again, and this is for me and anyone listening, is sometimes I can get really frustrated and be like, oh, poor me.
Yeah.
So not in a poor me way, but in a, how do we, I don't want to be disparaging to myself. I just want to name that there's a part of me that does that. There's an adult part of me that knows better, but there's a part of me that does that. And so I want to name that so that we have hope as we're hearing about these frustrating or just difficult impacts of being raised by an emotionally mature adult.
Yeah. And those impacts are often below the level of everyday consciousness. So they create patterns and styles of interaction or styles of self-inhibition that we're not even aware of. We're not even aware that there's another way to do it. And because we get trained to interact with emotionally immature people.
Mm.
So we get trained to put other people's emotional stability ahead of our own, that we're supposed to make sure that they're okay. and we get trained to make sure that we're keeping them feeling good about themselves. So we're always like, like scurrying to make sure that they don't feel disrespected or overlooked or not loved or any of these insecurity issues. We try to keep their self-esteem steady. And we just soak that up in childhood. It's like, it's like the air that we breathe. We do it automatically. Like, isn't that how you have a relationship? You keep the other person stabilized. You know?
You just explained how I ended up in my first marriage.
Well, yeah, because it's so essential to that early environment where the parent is the most important person in the relationship. They have many unresolved childhood needs of their own. Many of them have been traumatized in different
Yeah.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they can't help it. I mean, it's not because they're bad or wicked or, intentionally mean, but they can't help but be how they are. And so it's really hard for us not to carry that kind of solicitude that, we're overly accepting of other people's misbehavior or controlling behavior. We just become too accommodating. And that is understandable given the early relationship. But I would like to mention one or two big impacts that I think are so overlooked. One of them is self-knowledge. Like, emotionally immature people or parents are not very, well, they're not at all interested in helping their children to get to know themselves. Remember what I said about, the internal world, the subjective experience just doesn't compute with them. It's not a thing for them. So when your parent is not interested in what's going on inside you, you learn to overlook that, because it's not going to do you any good to be in touch with your feelings and your reactions when the most important people in your life are telling you you're going to get in trouble if you keep doing that. So we learn to unhook from ourselves, from our self-connection. And we learn to focus outward on other people and try to get that feeling of goodness, not from the inside, but from how much we've pleased other people. Okay. We're looking for, the right thing in the wrong place. Yeah. So that absence of self-knowledge is probably another thing that made the book reverberate with people, because when I said the part about emotional loneliness and put that in a context of understanding why a person would feel that way, that was like, I think that gave people like a huge boost in self-knowledge. It's like, oh, I'm not weird. I'm not a strange person who can't connect with other people. I'm emotionally lonely because I was emotionally alone. And, and they're able to understand how what should have been a normal, rich process of having their qualities reflected to them, building up a self-concept where they knew themselves and their qualities and their abilities. That process with a self-absorbed parent just doesn't happen, not in the way it needs to. And so that affects the person's self-confidence. It affects their sense of belonging. And it makes it very hard for them to feel like they have a leg to stand on when they have to take care of themselves. Because nowhere in their playbook from childhood is there anything about taking care of yourself.
Which I would like to say right now, because as people are listening, my brain immediately goes to solutions, and I want to name, you've a few books on this category, and one of them is about self-care for the adult children of emotionally immature people. So if you're listening to this and you're like, well, how do I build that self-concept? How do I get that inside out esteem? even if we have to start as adults, you've got resources. In addition to this book, you've got your workbook around that as well. Is there any other place you'd point people to? I mean, I think that would be a great place to start. I'm just thinking about solutions as you're like, oh my, if you're listening to this, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have that. I didn't have that.
Yeah, well, anything, I mean, thank goodness we have had such an explosion of self-care and self-help books and, in the past, I don't know, what, 20 years more. It used not to be a thing at all. There wasn't a category in Barnes and Noble or on, of course, Amazon wasn't around then, but there was nothing about self-help. I mean, maybe how to win friends and influence people, but that was, very business oriented. Um, but yeah, we really need all these different resources, and now we have podcasts, we have websites, we have people who are writing blogs, we have books, we have all these things that can actually help us to fill in the gaps that we didn't get from our own parents. Sometimes that's therapy, but I tell you what, I think people do amazing work with self-help books or self-help resources. It's just like you just give them the idea, and they find ways to run with that and use that in their lives. So it can be. I just like I love to walk through Barnes and Noble or scroll through Amazon until something hits my eye, and it's like invariably that's the thing I need to be thinking about or thing I'm working on. And that to me is the way that we transcend this emotional, being emotionally overlooked in childhood. Just like with your remothering, we can now take ourselves to that book or order that book for ourselves. We can give ourselves a mirroring experience that confirms us, validates us, and strengthens us, because you feel stronger when you understand something about yourself. So that self-knowledge piece is just incredibly important, I think.
So what I'm hearing you say, just to recap that last piece, is that one of the implications or one of the unfortunate side effects of being raised by an adult, by an emotionally immature parent, might be not having that deep self connection within us, or quieting it and like hearing our inner whispers and then being like, oh, that's not important. And one of the ways we can develop that self connection, that self concept, is really just trusting ourselves as we see a book that catches our eye, or folks are listening right now to this remothering masterclass, and just following your inner whispers that say, I'd like to learn this. And then you validating you and you saying, yeah, let's learn that. Yeah, let's explore that. And to take that really to the example of like as children, like depending on your parenting, the parents you had, like you might have gotten to try on in, if you were allowed to play or play dress up or just play, different things, like you might have gotten to try on different aspects of life that you get to try on now through books or reading or just trusting yourself. Am I
Yeah,
recapping what you said? Okay.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I feel so strongly about this whole concept of kind of crawling out from under the impacts of having emotionally immature parents. That two of my upcoming projects are about that. I'm doing a video series about the 6 impacts of having emotionally immature parents, what they do to your psyche, and once you become aware of it, what you can do about that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so we're going to do that in a video thing, and then we're going to also do a journal, which also will focus on those same impacts. So yeah, it's just very important to apply what we know about emotional immaturity to how it affects us in our adult lives, so that we can use our insight to help us not keep responding in the same ways.
I love that hope. And when will those projects be something, we'll be able to find them on your website, or how will we learn
Yes,
about those?
yes, they will be on my website. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, so then if you're listening to this and wondering, there will be a speaker page. You can look up Lindsay Gibson and we will have a link to her website where you can keep an eye out for those resources when they become available. So, and I love the hope of that because it's one thing to understand and it's been incredibly, it's just been incredible to have language. And then it's the next thing to say, okay, well, I had that experience and the language you use transcend being emotionally overlooked. That really, the hope that that's possible and the tools for getting there are really fantastic. And in addition to that, folks, there are tools in this book too. There are questionnaires and thought-provoking questions, and so there's a lot to do. But I will say for me, sometimes I'm like, oh, I can't believe I'm this age and learning stuff that I wish I'd learned when I was,
Mhm.
less than 10.
Mhm.
But what you're saying and what I'm reading is it's just not too late and it's really okay. And these are our journeys that we take as human beings.
Absolutely. And what I've come to realize is that it's always going to feel like it's too late or that we're learning it too late. It will
Mm.
always feel that way because when you get something really good, you can't help but say, gosh, I wish I'd had this before, I could have had so many more years, but that's the human experience. It really doesn't matter when you learn it because the what you are able to do with it from this point forward is, I mean, that's the fun part. That's the part where you get to try on these different things and you get to have the satisfaction of changing your life. Yeah.
Ah, wow. This has been amazing. I'm so honored, grateful, joyful, just filled with a lot of big, beautiful emotions for this experience of getting to talk with you. Is there anything I didn't think to ask you or that you'd want to say before we part and say goodbye?
I think we have really covered it. I would just finish up with one more thought about boundaries and
Yes.
why they tend not to work. Well, they do work, but why they tend to not give you a warm, good, satisfying feeling.
Please.
And that's because for the emotionally immature person, boundaries are abandonment.
Mm.
That doesn't make any sense, but that's how they experience it. You have dropped them. So I just want to put that in there so that you realize that they're really sometimes extreme responses to a legitimate boundary or request is because they go 0 to 60 on that abandonment thing and they completely feel dropped and unloved. So that's the only thing that I would
No,
add.
I love that context. And I'll say for those of us that are emotional helpers, it's not our responsibility. I'll just speak this because I feel it's not our responsibility to do anything about that knowledge. It's just an awareness that that's what's going on. It's not about us, and it's also not our responsibility.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that because that's really important. Yeah, they're not your abandoned baby. They're having a distorted reaction to a distortion of reality that they've made.
So, well, I'm having a hard time wanting to say goodbye, but it's definitely time, and I am so grateful for knowing you, like a synchronicity, and you even not knowing me. Like this was like a life-changing experience reading your book, and then just this conversation. I thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your next book. And yay! And for everybody listening, like I said, you'll find Lindsay Gibson on Amazon. You'll also find her on the speaker page with links to her website, so that you can keep an eye out for this upcoming book and upcoming resources. And thank you.
Oh, thank you, Simona. I mean, truly, it's been a joy talking with you, and I just think the work that you're doing is essential And you have just been such a joyful, responsive host. I just thank you very much for allowing me to be with you all today.
I'm receiving that. Noticing it's a little hard to receive that, but I'm receiving that, and I thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, with that, I'm having a hard time saying goodbye, but I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. And thank you for having me. I really, really love your work.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing it.